Somerville gardeners and gardening enthusiasts. We're here at the Somerville Public Library raised bed gardens, and we have a little gardening workshop today with Green City growers. You see behind me we have garlic that is ready to be harvested. This is what it looks like before it gets picked and you see it in the store. So we're going to show you how to harvest it and how you need to process it before you can actually eat it. And we're going to learn how to prune tomatoes on stakes and plant some new stuff. And we're also going to talk about getting rid of pests in the garden. We've had a lot of aphids who've been chowing down on our broccoli and kale, and we're not happy about that, but we're going to figure out some simple ways to deal with that. So we have Eric today joining us from Green City Growers, and he's going to show us a few tips and tricks.
Hey everyone, my name is Eric and I work for Green City Growers, and I'm here at the Somerville Public Library, and we're going to be doing a lot of garden maintenance today. We're going to focus on the garlic, some pest management, and we're also going to get some new stuff planted in today. So we're going to start off with our garlic plants right here. So I guess there are two main parts of the garlic that are edible and that we could use. One section is a little bit past due, which is our top part right here. This whole stem or offshoot from the garlic plant itself is called the garlic scape. So normally we would harvest these before this bulb, which is going to turn into the flower, has fully formed, and they'll sort of grow like that, and they'll loop around like that. So if you're ever growing garlic at home, once you see the stem or the scape, start to twirl around like that, you know it's ready to harvest. You just take out a knife or a pair of scissors, cut it like that, and you'd have your garlic scape. So the garlic scape is edible. It's delicious. You sort of cut it up like you would scallions, but it's got a more mild garlic flavor. So yeah, we're gonna be harvesting a lot of these today. So just snipping these off, and then we're going to be getting into harvesting the garlic bulbs themselves. So typically these garlic scapes are a little bit past due. We'd want them before this bulb on top is formed, and we want to do that because if we cut off the scapes before the bulb is formed, the plant isn't going to produce or isn't going to put its energy into growing this. It's going to put its energy into growing the bulb of garlic underneath the ground, which is what we're really looking for. So actually we can cut these down later. I just want to take a peek to see how some of our garlic is doing. So gonna grab my handy trowel over here and sort of dig or scrape away some of the salt marsh hay that was down as a winter protection. Is also a great weed suppressant. Just gonna dig around, sort of put a hole or this nice circle around our garlic bulbs like so. And then just gonna stick my hand in, see if we can find out where they are. And these ones are a little bit deeper down. And we end up with some garlic like this. So once you have the garlic bulbs, what you're going to want to do is, we're going to cut off the scape like so. And then the next step that we're going to do is cut off the stalk itself. This is going to help in the curing process, just because there's less plant material. It's going to be easier for the plant to start to dry out. So we're going to leave about 6 or 8 inches or so from the bulb itself of stalk. And we're just going to slice like this. Then from there, we're going to wipe some of the dirt off with our hand. With garlic, you don't want to actually wash it as soon as it gets out of the ground. You don't really want to wash it at any point. Because if you wash it after it's been cut like this, you have a better chance of introducing like any pathogens or any excess moisture into the garlic. And at this stage, we're really trying to dry it out, so we don't want to be adding any moisture to it. So yeah, we're gonna be peeling away some of this outer layer. Peel this off. and you should be left with a nice sort of papery coating along it that will, once it's dried, it'll be like what you see in the grocery store, that nice sort of white papery coating on any of the bulbs of garlic. Yeah, garlic is a pretty fun crop to be able to grow. It's also like super easy to grow. All you really have to do is take a clove from the bulb itself, stick it root side in the ground towards the end of the year. So we plant our garlic typically at the end of October into early November. It overwinters, so it stays in the ground over the winter. We cover it with salt marsh hay to help insulate it a little bit. But yeah, over the winter, the clove is going to spend a lot of its time producing roots and just forming more of the bulb itself. And then when springtime comes around, garlic is usually one of the first crops that you're going to see popping up out of the soil. And it's ready typically mid-July is when it's good to be able to harvest. So it's a very, very long season crop. So you have to plan out where you're gonna be putting it, because you won't be able to have anything there in that location until next summer, pretty much. You can like just pull garlic up by hand, but I always find it easier to have a shovel with me to sort of like get underneath the roots. Less likely of a chance that when you're trying to pull it out, the stem will snap and then you're just left with a garlic bulb underground, which could end up just rotting and doesn't give you any good use out of it. A lot of these are going to be on the smaller side because the scapes were left on, so more energy ended up getting, the plant ended up putting more energy into the scape, which would turn into the flower than it did into the actual bulb. But that's all right, because we're still going to end up with some nice garlic bulbs and some garlic scapes as well. When you take like the individual cloves from these plants, you're going to want to put it, like I said earlier, root side down, but it can go pretty deep into the soil. It can go about 5 to 6 inches below the ground. So reason for that is it's going to have more access to nutrients down there, and it's also going to be a little bit more insulated over the winter, because all garlic has to overwinter, at least in New England anyway. So basically, once your garlic is harvested, you could use this now, but because it still has a lot of moisture in it, the flavor isn't going to be as concentrated as if we were to let it dry out. So with the curing process, you're going to want to leave it in a dark, dry room for about a week and a half to 2 weeks. Now that we've harvested our garlic, we're going to start working on some of our pest management for today. So some of our biggest issues that I've been seeing are aphids. So aphids are these tiny little sap-sucking insects that cluster all along like the inner workings of the plants. So right in here, all those little gray things right there are a bunch of aphids. They're basically like mosquitoes for plants. Like mosquitoes suck our blood, aphids will suck out all of the moisture and all of the sap from the leaves, and instead of having nice beautiful kale leaves like this, we end up with sort of ugly curled up leaves like that. They aren't as appealing to look at, and when you look inside and you see a bunch of aphids, that's just not the most appetizing. So we're going to try to get rid of these. So we're going to try to get rid of these today. So when it comes to like pest removal, the tried and true way that always works is the mechanical method of simply going through every leaf and just rubbing your finger across and sort of smushing all the aphids that you see. So this is good if you have like 2 or 3 plants, but if you have a lot of kale plants, or if you have aphids on multiple different types of crops, like we have aphids on our kale over here, then we also have it on some of the broccoli over there. There are some easier ways to be able to do that. So the first one that we're going to be working with today, this is a spray solution of alcohol soap. So alcohol soap is something that we use. It's a mix of water, rubbing alcohol, and a splash of dish soap, just so it helps to stick to the plants easier. So when we're using these, we want to make sure that we're getting good coverage on the leaves and really getting in all the nooks and crannies of the plant, especially with our curly kale. So we just give this everything a nice spray like so. Yeah, you can really get in there. And the rubbing alcohol won't do anything to the plant, and neither will the dish soap. What it's going to do is pretty much like just dry out the aphids itself that it comes in contact with. So really important to get as much coverage with this as possible. There's a species of aphid for pretty much every crop. So aphids on kale tend to be either black or gray. Aphids on tomatoes, I've typically seen like sort of a pinkish red color for those ones. And then some other crops are just like bright green. So they come in lots of different shapes, sizes, or not really shapes and sizes, but definitely plenty of different colors. So actually, if you come in here, you can see this is a big cluster. That's definitely going to get rid of all that. Yeah, so that's not appetizing. Definitely don't want to eat that. In my experience, on like larger scale operations, if we have like tomatoes or something like that we're clearing out for aphids, we'll wear like a sweatshirt or an overshirt or something over it, so we can just remove that once we're done working with those plants, and then we won't be covered with aphids. But they're very small, and like they'll really stick to you. It's like if you brush up against a plant that's covered with aphids, you might not even notice, but you could look down like 10 minutes later and just see like a few crawling on your arm or something like that. So yeah, that is pretty much our main way of aphid pest removal that we're gonna be working with. Very simple: dish soap, rubbing alcohol, and water, and it works great. So one like way that you can tell when they're aphids is the leaves will really start to curl up like this. So they aren't like flat and smooth, and it's most likely that the aphids are right underneath. So curl down like such, and then you got a few living over there, so you just smush those. But once we get like more sections that have more of them, like underside of this leaf, for example, right in there, we're just gonna give this whole plant this spray. One thing that I noticed in the other bed was that there were some nasturtiums planted. Nasturtiums are a great like vector crop, so they will attract aphids. Ideally, they will attract aphids to the nasturtiums themselves, so the nasturtiums will get all the damage, and it will avoid, the aphids will avoid going over to some of the other crops. But sometimes there are just too many aphids for like a couple nasturtium plants, so they will just naturally migrate over there. But you can see usually on like the undersides of the leaves, there'll be a decent amount of black aphids. Let's see if we can find some. Oh. So not a ton, but those tiny little black dots right there are the aphids. Normally they'd be coating all the entire like undersides of these leaves, but it's better to have them on some nasturtiums, which we're only really using for flowers and to look nice. We'd rather have them on these than on our crops that we're actually going to be eating. So you've probably seen like some of these silver tapes hanging from both of our trellises. So these tapes are basically called scare tapes. So when we had the peas growing earlier in the season, the birds were really getting to them and getting to our peas before we could. So these scare tapes, just like the sprinkling sound it makes and the reflections, so like any shimmering sort of light like that, is going to be enough to sort of distract the birds away from our snap peas and eventually our tomatoes and cucumbers that are over in that bed over there. So we're going to keep these up for as long as we have anything basically that's going to fruit growing upwards on our trellis. Next up, what we're going to be doing is pruning some of our tomato plants. So when we're pruning our plants, we're going to be going after the branches that are called suckers. So if we take a peek down at our tomato plant right here, so this is its main stem. So this is what all of the fruiting branches are going to come off of. We have our leaves that are going to be photosynthesizing, making food for our tomato plant. And then right in here, this little guy and even this one right here are going to be our suckers. So suckers are basically branches that they won't necessarily produce any fruit. They're more just extra vegetative growth to help the tomato gain more food through photosynthesis in the sun, but it doesn't really need it. It's more just something that the plant grows naturally because it wants to grow. But we can actually remove those suckers, and that will make the tomato plant focus more of its energy on producing fruit instead of just making branches that won't actually give anything to us. So if you take a look down here, this is an example of a baby sucker. So this is going off at a 90-degree angle, or roughly a 90-degree angle from the stem. And the suckers typically come off at a 45-degree angle or so. So that's one way that you can tell if it's a sucker or like a main branch like that. So we're just gonna take little pruners, snip that off, and up here, we're gonna snip that off as well. And actually down below, we have a better example of what a sucker can turn into. So this was the main branch, and this at one point was like one of the tiny little suckers that I just removed. But this one won't produce any fruit, so we're just gonna get rid of it, snip it down at the base. And at some point, some of the suckers might end up like being as big as the main branch, so it seems kind of counterproductive to cut off something that's so like large and seems so integral to the plant. But pruning is super essential. It's going to help focus all of the plant's energy on fruit instead of leaves. And also, if there's less plant material just around the plant itself, you have better airflow, which is going to help with disease reduction and prevention. Because if the leaves are too moist, you'll end up with like fungal diseases. If you have any leaves that are touching the ground, you can end up with like bacterial and viral diseases as well. And tomatoes are extremely susceptible to pretty much most plant diseases. So keeping them safe and making sure they have lots of airflow, like these two plants right here, is going to be really important to having a nice, successful tomato season. So, what we're going to be doing next, we're going to be removing our sugar snap peas that have been growing up along the trellising. So this year, because it was pretty rainy in the spring and pretty cold, sugar snap peas typically did not do too well this year just because it took a long time for them to germinate. So I'm going to be removing them, but I'm not going to be actually removing the roots from the soil. So I'm just going to be cutting the plants right down at the base as close to the soil line as possible. So we'll just end up with like a little nub like that, but we'll be able to remove the rest of these plants. And the reason for that, here's a good example. So peas and anything in the legume family, so peas, beans, or anything like that, have this really cool trait where they can fix nitrogen from the air. So nitrogen is pretty much the most like important element that plants need. It helps keep them green, so it allows them to grow, allows them to photosynthesize and produce their own food. So all these little bumps along the roots themselves are actually bacteria that have a symbiotic relationship with legume plants, forming these little clusters. So these are able to absorb nitrogen from the air. So it'll be in the air, end up into the soil. They'll be able to turn it into a form of nitrogen that's usable for the plants. And it basically, having legumes planted next to or in a bed that has things that are heavy feeders like tomatoes, zucchini, cucumbers, or anything like that, which we have growing on here, it's going to be sort of living nitrogen supply for them. And yeah, so that's why when I'm pulling out peas or beans or anything like that, I typically want to leave this in the soil, because even if the plant is dead, the bacteria attached to the roots is still alive, so they'll still be able to fix the nitrogen and essentially continually add a store of that good nutrients into the soil for the plants. So peas, never remove the roots. Keep them in there, and everything else will be a little bit happier at the end of the season. And you also won't have to add fertilizer as often. The next little bit, we're gonna be doing a little bit of harvesting before we get into some of our planting. So we're gonna be working with our lettuce today. So this lettuce is looking very good, very healthy. So typically the way that you want to harvest lettuce, so this is individual heads like so. We're just going to be taking our knife or pair of scissors that you have, cutting as close down to the base as possible like so. You should start to see some of this white stuff ooze out of it. That's just something natural that lettuce, it just does that. So be able to get plenty of this to harvest today. Give it a wash and have a nice salad later on. So we'll actually just harvest all of this. And if we wanted to, we could leave all the stumps in the ground and they would continue to keep on growing, and it would form like new heads like this. I'd say in about like 3 to 4 weeks, it would be looking like this again. But I actually think I want to plant something different in here today. Lettuce definitely likes cooler weather. There are some varieties that can tolerate heat, but a general rule of thumb is like lettuce is definitely more of a spring crop. Just gonna start off by loosening up the soil a little bit. So I'm gonna take a little hand rake right here. Not gonna get too deep, just sort of loosening up the top like 1/2 inch or so. I have some seeds with me today. The first are some carrot seeds. So these are not like your typical orange carrots. Thought these ones would be pretty fun to plant today. These are deep purple carrots, so they're gonna be purple for obvious reasons. So these ones will be pretty cool. They'll be ready in about like 3.5 to 4 months or so. So with carrots, you can, I guess there are like 2 ways that you can plant them. One is just like making a row like so, and just like taking the seeds and literally just sprinkling them in like such. But when you're planting like this, you can risk having some seeds be too close together. So you'll just end up having to thin those out later on. If you don't want to do that, and you don't want to worry about thinning later, you can just plant them about, I'd say about 1 inch apart, just like individual seeds like so. And then you won't have to worry about thinning. And it takes a little bit more time in the moment, but saves more time later on. So I prefer this method. These are just regular green bush beans. You can plant them like pretty much throughout the summer, in my opinion. I think that these are very, very tasty, and you can grow a decent amount of them in an area only this size. So they'll need about 6 to 8 inches of space. So the way that I'm going to be planting these today is sort of a staggered pattern, so we can try to get the most in here as possible. So we have seed here, we do another seed about this far apart, and then like that, and then so on and so forth, sort of like walking our way up. And for the seed placement, have something like here, toss it in like so, and like this. So typically when we're doing seeding, the depth is going to be pretty important depending on what type of seed it is. So these are bean seeds, and you can see that like the seed itself is actually pretty large. So these ones, well, we can plant these a little bit deeper, maybe about like 1/2 inch or like finger knuckle deep into the soil, and they'll be fine. But if we were to plant like a carrot seed or lettuce seed that deep, it might not germinate, or if it does germinate, it would be very, very slow. So typically the size of the seed is like related to the amount of energy that is actually stored in the seed. So larger seeds have more energy, therefore you can plant them deeper and they'll have more energy to be able to break up through the soil. But lettuce seeds, carrot seeds, radish seeds, or something like that, I actually have some radish seeds right here, are a lot smaller. So these ones you would not be sticking you wouldn't be sticking your finger in the ground and making a hole. You could either just sprinkle these right on top of the soil, or just make a tiny, very shallow row with your finger and seed them that way. We also have some transplants that I brought with me today, so that are going to be going over in the garlic section. I think we're going to be planting some Swiss chard. So these beautiful guys right here. I love planting Swiss chard just because the stalks and the stems have just fantastic color to them. Sometimes the leaves will end up turning like a nice deep maroon color, and just really vibrant, adds a nice splash of color, like an edible splash of color to the garden. So we're going to be planting a couple of those, probably 1, 2, 3 in the front, and then I have some kale plants that we're going to do 1 and 2 in the back row. So we'll take our transplant. So I like to just loosen up the root ball a little bit, especially if the plant is sort of root bound like these ones were. So you can see at the bottom the roots are sort of starting to swirl in on each other, which means they've run out of soil, and therefore they're running out of nutrients. So we're just going to loosen this up a little bit like so. It's convenient that there's already hay down here, so we won't have to really worry about weeding this section in the future. The hay is going to do a great job of suppressing any weeds that might be in the soil. We're going to take our plug, we're going to stick it down about the depth of the plug itself, and then we're going to cover it up with soil, and I'll make sure that there's just enough to go over like the top of the plug, but we don't want to have too much that we have soil covering too much of the stem, because that can just lead to rot. We want to make sure that it's pretty flush and smooth with their soil like this. Give it a quick press. You can press it down sort of firmly. You don't want to be pressing it down too far, because that could end up you could end up with some compaction issues, but just enough so that the roots are really going to be able to absorb all the moisture that's in the soil, and yeah, really just start expanding into the soil that they have around for them. So this is Toscano kale, or some people call it dinosaur kale. Very tasty. You can make kale chips out of it and basically use it how you would use any other type of kale. I'm gonna pick the 2 biggest ones that I can find in here. This one, and let's see, I'm gonna say this one right here on the end. Kale plants will get decently big. On average, I'd say by the end of the season, this plant will be about this tall, maybe 1.5 to 2 feet tall, and it'll branch out a little bit, and it'll maybe be about 1.5 feet wide. So we want to make sure that they have enough space so that their leaves aren't touching and that everything can grow to its full size. Same way that we planted the other. Loosen up the root ball a little bit, place it in, and then casually just press it down a little bit like so. Yeah, the final step is, because we have hay here, we're gonna cover the bases with hay, and like so. We won't see any weeds coming up around these plants, which is great. Saves us a little bit of work later on. Yeah, we have successfully planted some transplants as well as some seeds, and we're looking good to go.